Hello, Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com. Today I want to talk about water. So I've talked about food in other places. I've gone into the Mind diet. I've gone into some of the dangers, sugar and other things that can be introduced into the diet that can increase your chances, whether directly or indirectly, of becoming susceptible to Alzheimer's at a later date. But one thing that is sometimes neglected in conversations that I've looked at online and information is about the importance of having access to clean drinking water. And we take it for granted because, we don't have like obvious sewage running through our pipes. Most of us, some of us do, I suppose, but we don't generally think about the fact that our water is laced with a cocktail of contaminants and chemicals, some of which are worse than others, and it's going to depend on the geographical area in many cases, but it's really kind of appalling when you look at the kind of stuff that's actually found in the water. And I was recently reminded of this. So you can see Americans exposed to toxic chemicals in drinking water dramatically understated. In other words, previously there was a report that indicated that Americans were exposed, but even the hundreds of millions, 110, I think, million people who were supposed to have been affected, that might have been underestimated. So this was recently published. You see here from Fox News, January the 22nd. This is 2020 here, but if you go delve into the article a little bit, you'll see tap water in the United States is contaminated with toxic fluorinated chemicals at a higher rate than previously thought. Now, the main focus of this article is the quote, forever chemicals, also known as perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, it's a mouthful there, are resistant to breaking down. That's why they're called forever chemicals, and they may affect far more than 110 million Americans previously estimated. In other words, 110 million is not enough to have an effect, to be affected. It may be affecting far more. And some of these chemicals are known to cause cancer, liver damage, low birth weight, and other health problems. Now, I want to stress some of this conversation, you're not going to find explicit references to Alzheimer's disease, or at least I didn't in some of these things. But when you think about what I've gone into in other presentations about how there are certain factors that can increase your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease, that's the first thing. So, can we rule out that some of these factors are indirectly related to contaminated water? No. And the second thing is that the cause of Alzheimer's disease is not well understood. And I'm going to get into that just a little bit more here in just a minute. This was not just unique to one spectrum of the media. Now, this is The Guardian. They operate out of the United Kingdom. Their article, U.S. drinking water contamination with forever chemicals far worse than scientists thought. And then they note that there were the highest levels in Miami, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and this was by a watchdog agency they note. Or again, U.S. News and World Report. U.S. drinking water widely contaminated with forever chemicals. And of course, they're all referring to the same findings by this Environmental Working Group, EWG, and shows the group's previous estimate of 110 million could be far too low, which is, it's just crazy. It's nearly impossible, says one spokesman, to avoid contaminated drinking water from these chemicals. Nearly impossible. And then it says the chemicals were used in products like Teflon, Scotchgard, firefighting foam, industrial byproducts, and this kind of thing. And they're just lacing the water throughout the United States in only one location, Meridian, Mississippi. And they have deep wells and had no detectable levels of these perfluoroalkyl substances. But these aren't the only ones, and I just thought I would do a brief video just kind of looking at, because I've done an article, and here's the importance. Obviously everyone's exposed, and here's another factor. In 34 places where this watchdog group found these PFAS chemicals, contamination had not been publicly reported by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, obviously the U.S. government organization, or state environmental agencies. So in other words, people were in the dark. They didn't even realize how their water could be negatively impacting their health. PBS.org, even if your drinking water gets a passing grade, it may not be safe. Now here's the upshot here. There are no federal limits on half of the contaminants detected in drinking water, according to the report. Now here's the thing. That means that even when the water is processed in such a way as to remove contaminants, you got to realize that for most of these water treatment facilities, or many of them, they are removing and treating water per guidelines that have been set up by the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, or state or local regulation. So they are looking at things that the government tells them they have to look at. But they may or may not, and they probably are not looking at much beyond that because it's going to be cost prohibitive. So in other words, they're not just running water through a treatment plant in order to make it pure. They are rather specifically focusing on certain things to remove. And here's the point, is there are no federal limits on half of the contaminants that are in the drinking water. There's nobody trying to remove them. That's the really scary part. They're not being acknowledged. They're not attempting to remove them. And some of these can cause health problems. I've gotten into this. In the past, I have an article, Can Contaminated and Dirty Water Cause Alzheimer's Disease? Obviously, cause is a really tricky thing, just in general. But I have personally gone into this additionally with respect to the focus of Alzheimer's, obviously, what causes Alzheimer's, 10 possibilities. And in fact, I did a video on this where I actually get into 11 possibilities because an additional possibility became salient to me in between the time I did my written work and the time that I did the YouTube video. But the point is that there is no definite cause that's been decided on for Alzheimer's disease. And you got to bear that in mind. But this is part of the reason why I think the plausibility of water being implicated in at least some of these causes should at least be considered. We should consider that dirty water, or same thing with food. Diet's going to play a role, but then dirty water could also play a role. We need clean water. And I think part of the issue here is that there are so many possible causes, and I outlined a number of them in my video, and you can see here. So plaques and tangles and acetylcholine deficiency are at the top of the list, but then further down, inflammation, toxin exposure, okay, both of those are going to be relevant to dirty water. Homocysteine levels too high, that's going to be related to proper hydration, and I'll touch on that really briefly at the end. Hormone levels, well, mostly being too low, but you should bear in mind that hormones have been found in water. Infection, that's going to be relevant because water can be laced with bacteria. Metal poisoning is certainly relevant to water. Aluminum, copper, mercury, and lead have all been found in water or put in water on purpose, as aluminum can sometimes be a byproduct of various filtration processes. Oxidation also is relevant. So out of this list of possible causes, you can see no fewer than 4 or 5 of these easily are related potentially to the cleanliness, the purity of drinking water. Let's look at inflammation. So according to the American Journal of Epidemiology, in an article titled The Association Between Water Supply and Inflammatory Bowel Disease, and you can see here this was published in 2008, the underlined sentence, the authors found that the risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease, including ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, was associated with high iron content in drinking water, right? Now this is obviously going to be relevant to heavy metals in the water, which is a separate category, but here just inflammatory bowel disease. Now, I'm not saying that this study had anything directly to do with dementia, cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's. It didn't. But my point is that there are people who believe that Alzheimer's may be the result of chronic inflammation, and here we have an association with certain things in the drinking water, specifically iron, that it's causing other conditions in people that are also inflammation-based conditions, and inflammatory bowel disease is one. How about toxin exposure? Well, this was the thrust of some of these articles, so we can probably go quickly through this. According to the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, they literally, in an article that was titled on their website, "Bottled Water for all the time?" Look at the highlighted area there in red. All drinking water should be filtered to remove toxins. That they just lay that out for you. This is the British Medical Journal, highly respected medical journal. And then they go on to say toxins in tap water include arsenic, aluminum fluoride, trace amounts of discarded medications, chlorine, and chlorine disinfection byproducts. How about infection? Well, in my video on cause, I mentioned that there are researchers who have discovered that the brains of Alzheimer's affected individuals sometimes have bacteria inside of the brain. And this has been associated with those kinds of conditions that usually cause dental problems, like gum disease. So there are specific bacteria that have been discovered. And the hypothesis was, just to kind of rehearse it briefly, was that some people think, well, maybe Alzheimer's is caused by bacteria. Well, the causal direction is not clear, and I get into more of this in detail in the cause video. Obviously, Alzheimer's could cause changes in the body that make it more susceptible to bacterial infection. It could just be incidental. There's any number of different ways in which these things can be fitted together. But on the assumption that Alzheimer's may have something to do with infection, isn't it interesting that water can also be a delivery vehicle for various infectious agents? So, International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, the article Water Microbiology, Bacterial Pathogens and Water, published in 2010, cholera, typhoid fever, bacillary dysentery, E. coli, numerous, and these are just the spotlighted ones just in the abstract. These numerous infectious agents can be delivered via dirty water. Or again, metal poisoning. So here, aluminum, copper, lead, mercury. We already saw lead cropped up in the article on inflammatory bowel disease. I'm going to hold off on aluminum for just a minute. So take a look. European Journal of Medical Research, chronic poisoning by copper in tap water. Now this was a German study. And look at some of the highlights here. Copper can induce acute and chronic intoxications. But in the middle there, you see that some of these were, I guess, suspected of having been the result of copper plumbing. So copper pipes seem like in this research were enough to potentially leach copper into the water that was then causing both acute and chronic, quote, intoxication in human beings, and a number of serious gastrointestinal problems here from nausea, vomiting, colic, diarrhea. But skipping down, it said that they found that these kinds of diseases and conditions can even be caused by copper concentrations below the allowed concentration. Now, obviously, the one that they're talking about here is allowed by German law, German guidelines. So it's not directly applicable to the United States, but it's probably similar. I would suspect that the United States is not stricter with regard, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that we are not stricter here with regard to our regulations in terms of copper concentration in water than they are in Germany. Copper is also implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Some people say it's a deficiency. Some people say it's an excess that causes a greater risk, so it's unclear. But here again, possibly a contaminant in your water. Or how about this article, the Environmental Health Perspectives Journal, Exposure on Tap, Drinking Water as an Overlooked Source of Lead. Just briefly on lead again, Providence, Rhode Island, Portland, Oregon have had lead problems in tap water, and yet, according to some critics, they haven't properly reported them. And then it adds, and this article was 2010 also, unlike most contaminants, lead gets into the water after it leaves a treatment plant. So sometimes it comes in through lead solder joints, lead pipes, faucets, fixtures, and you can see there lead is a close to home contaminant. So the point is, don't rely, you can't possibly, even if our water treatment facilities were 100% reliable, you could still have a contaminant like lead because lead is going to get in, or often gets in, after the water leaves the treatment facility. So this indicates that whatever solution you might, no pun intended, whatever solution to the problem you might want to implement is going to have to be implemented very close to the place where you actually receive the water. The Science of Nature, this is a German journal, Nature Wissenschaften, and you can see the nature of mercury in tap water from 1994. More recently, the EPA's Guidelines for Drinking Water, 4th edition, 2017. Looking at mercury, you can note a couple of things. Mercury, inorganic mercury, or organic mercury, two different types. Some of them have been found in water sources, but it notes that the main place of delivery, the main place of exposure is going to be in food rather than in water. But yet mercury can be toxic to kidneys. It can be toxic to brain. And mercury is very damaging potentially. And so you obviously this is one of the heavy metals that can pose a great problem. And it can be found in dental amalgams and in other places you can be exposed to mercury. The International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, article Water Quality in Brain Function, 2018. Let's just look at the highlighted sentence. In the United States, regulations are in place to ensure the quality of drinking water. However, regulatory guidelines may at times fail to achieve their purpose. And some of these contaminants are known to have adverse neurological impacts. Copper, potentially one. Lead is certainly one. Mercury, we just looked at, is certainly got a negative neurological impact. And here's the kicker, the reason why I've highlighted this particular article is because trace amounts could be impacting you. Even if there's no large scale quantity in the water, trace amounts might be impacting you. And here's the thing, a paucity of studies focused on determining how long-term exposure to minute levels of contaminants in drinking water may pose a significant health hazard. So a paucity means that maybe there are not literally none, but there are very few. Paucity, of course, means they're scarce. You can't really find studies on this question. And so here we see hazard posed by seemingly low-level exposures to heavy metals, and here they include cadmium, mercury, and lead, is exacerbated or made worse by the tendency of these metals to accumulate in tissues over time. And they all have negative and detrimental effects to the brain, as you can see here. Concurrent exposure to a range of toxic heavy metals, including lead, cadmium, arsenic, methylmercury, are of notable concern in view of their persistent effects on the brain. Now, here's another question. They haven't really studied the effects of trace amounts of these, but they also haven't studied them in combination with one another. And that's an important consideration, because a study that just looks at the effect of, let's say, cadmium, or just looks at the effect of methylmercury, by itself may not disclose the full risk if you're exposed to methylmercury in conjunction with arsenic and lead. So if they're all together, they might have an effect that's worse or that's different than if they were singly encountered. 2019, Journal Amino Acids talks about the importance of rehydration during exercise to prevent the increase of homocysteine. Now, this doesn't have to do with the quality of the water, but it has to do with the importance of rehydration. As we saw, my summary list of the possible causes from my video, homocysteine levels being too high is one possible cause, and one way of keeping those levels in check is to properly hydrate yourself. Well, obviously then, in order to properly hydrate yourself, you're going to need clean water. So that's why I included here. But look here again, grave long-term risk. Low doses of cadmium can promote excess free radical-related oxidative events. So here's another possible tie-in. We talked about oxidation being a contributory factor to developing dementia and cognitive impairment. And here you see cadmium in drinking water can have an oxidative impact on the brain. And again, this can be low levels. Low levels of cadmium, mercury, and lead are potentially enough to cause problems, because if for no other reason, they accumulate over time. So here we remember Alzheimer's disease, one of the main risk factors is age. And there's a number of reasons why this could be the case. Decreasing hormones, other things might be at play, but one reason that a person who's of advanced age may have a greater risk of Alzheimer's disease is because they may have had more time to accumulate these kinds of metals in their body. I'm not saying that's the case, but it's possible. And so we get to aluminum. This was an article, 1989, Chicago Tribune, and you can see three facts they highlight. First of all, high levels of aluminum have been found in the brains of victims of Alzheimer's. 2, aluminum is commonly used to purify drinking water. And 3, neither federal nor state government has set standards for the amount of aluminum that is allowed. Now, The Lancet, another well-respected, like the British Medical Journal, they published an article also in 1989 saying the geographical relation between Alzheimer's disease and aluminum was relevant, and you can read the underlined sentence. The risk of Alzheimer's disease was 1.5 times higher in those areas where aluminum concentration was higher than in districts where it was less. Reviews on environmental health. 2002 article, a review of epidemiologic studies on aluminum and silica in relation to Alzheimer's disease and associated disorders. And in the conclusion, I'll just highlight a few sentences here. The most solid results have been obtained with dialysis encephalopathy, in which aluminum might be a causal agent. However, the link between aluminum in drinking water and cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease is still controversial. And obviously they acknowledge that there's a complex multifactorial pathology for Alzheimer's, including genetic risk, and I just did a video on that, factors like age, gender, education level, consumption of wine or tobacco, in other words, diet, and it may be, on top of all of that, final sentence, that only a fraction of the population is susceptible to aluminum toxicity, even if it's a factor. European Journal of Neurology from 2006, the analysis of the effect of aluminum in drinking water and something called transferrin C2. This is the reason for the study. Although highly controversial, the hypothesis of a link between aluminum in drinking water and Alzheimer's disease has been supported by several epidemiological studies. Now, in their particular study, they start off and they conclude rather by saying that there are certain reasons to think that aluminum might be relevant. For example, that in chelation treatments, patients seem to improve. There were therapeutic effects to iron and aluminum chelator administrations. Then further in the middle there, you can see our findings suggests that neither transferrin C2 allele nor the combination of transferrin and aluminum contribute to the development of Alzheimer's disease. So their finding in this study was negative, but they already opened with acknowledging that other studies have discovered a link, or have not discovered, maybe is the wrong word, but have suggested there could be a link. And then the final aspect there, final little segment, the exact effect of transferrin and exposure to aluminum remains unclear, and more studies need to be undertaken. So even though their findings were negative, others' findings have been different, and they acknowledge the need for further research. Finally, the British Medical Journal, again, I'm going to go back to the article Bottled Water for All the time. And here is one of their final statements here. However, bottled water is not necessarily better than tap water, as much of it is actually bottled tap water. And you can see that on some bottled waters, it literally will say the source is municipal water supply. In addition to that, plastic bottles, which are often used, have the ability to leach bisphenol A, or BPA, into the water that you drink, and that is a hormone disruptor, and it's been implicated in numerous problems, including early puberty, obesity, cancer, and obesity is also a risk factor for Alzheimer's. Finally, they state, to preserve health and prevent disease, all drinking water should be filtered. And then they add the best filter is a granular activated carbon block filter as recommended by the Environmental Protection Agency, and that kind of filter removes most harmful chemicals and metals. And then it says filtered water is best carried in bottles made of steel or glass, but not plastic. Now, I will get into this in greater detail. I have other written pieces on the website that indicate water purification devices that I've used. I'm going to develop a follow-up video to kind of suggest possible interventions that you might contemplate performing to try to improve the quality of the water in your house. But I just thought I would bring this to your attention. I am not a medical doctor. I'm not a medical researcher. I don't have any expertise here. It's just because of all the stuff in the water, and because of the fact that if for no other reason Alzheimer's exact cause is unknown, well, how can we rule out that dirty water may have something to do with it? And I think we can't, unfortunately. And so we would be well advised to at least attempt to remove some of these contaminants from our water. And if we can do that in our own homes, I'd want to know about it. And so I think other people may share my opinion in that regard. If you found something of use in this video, I ask you to please like it, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you so much.